Welcome back to Pension Pursuit, the game where taxpayers, young and old, face off against their own state politicians and state employees. In the previous round, we learned that our state politicians can win the game only if they're re-elected, so they tell taxpayers and state employees they won't raise taxes or cut services in an effort to win. But there is one thing standing in the way of their re-election and ultimate victory: the budget, or bank in our game, which by state law, they're required to balance. Now, the acceptable, standard, and transparent way for state governments to spend more than they take in is to issue a bond. That means the state will borrow money from investors and promise to repay them with interest in the future. But that's not what most state politicians are doing. They're massively borrowing money that should go into their pension systems. The problem starts by promising state employees they will pay them a pension upon retirement. However, the state isn't setting aside nearly enough money today to cover these promises. The more generous the pension, the bigger the problem. When the pension comes due, if there isn't sufficient money in the pension fund, then taxpayers will have to cover the shortfall. These state pension obligations can't be forgiven by bankruptcy either. In fact, they generally take priority in terms of what debts get paid. To help determine how to fund these pensions, state politicians hire actuaries to calculate how much they need to contribute today in order to fund a future pension promise. Our actuary is a statistician specially trained to make these complex calculations. The actuaries generate a report that indicates the money required to be set aside to fully fund future pension promises made to today's employees. However, some actuaries use stricter standards than others. And while some states follow the guidelines quite closely, others practically ignore them. So each actuary and state operates under its own set of rules. States and municipalities that make the pension contributions required by the actuaries can still fall well short of adequately funding their retiree pension programs if the actuaries assume unrealistically high returns on pension investments. 7.75% is a typical rate of return used by states and municipalities. A compound annual return of 7.75% means that the money in the pension fund is expected to double every 10 years. So, if our taxpayer contributes $1 today at 7.75%, that dollar will be worth $2 in 10 years, $4 in 20 years, and $8 30 years from now. State politicians that budget using 7.75% as an expected rate of return are assuming that the money they set aside for pensions is going to grow very fast. A state that needs to make a $100,000 pension payment in 20 years and uses a 7.75% expected rate of return would only set aside $25,000 today, expecting a quadrupling during the period. For budgeting purposes, wouldn't it be smarter to assume that the money that's set aside isn't going to grow extremely fast? In the next round of Pension Pursuit, we'll look at the consequences of expecting high rates of return, what risks are associated with it, and how it affects our players, the taxpayers, the state employees, and the state politicians.